The war had ended, but the screams hadn't. Across the smoking ruins of Germany in 1945, hospitals overflowed with the broken. Wehrmacht conscripts, civilians, refugees, and prisoners of war. The corridors smelled of antiseptic and ash. The nurses who had once served the Reich now worked with trembling hands, stitching the remnants of a nation that no longer existed. They had been taught that the enemy was monstrous, that Americans were barbarians in uniform. But one night, in a ward dimly lit by shattered windows, a wounded American reached for the hand of a German nurse and said, "Thank you." It was such a small word, yet it broke something inside her. Because in that moment, surrounded by destruction, the word didn't sound like victory or surrender. It sounded like forgiveness. War trains people to hate in uniform patterns, to kill without thought. But when the killing stops, and two human beings face each other with nothing left but wounds and exhaustion, the walls built by propaganda begin to fall. What happens when mercy survives the war that tried to destroy it? If you believe history's quietest stories are the ones that reveal who we truly are, then stay. Subscribe, share, and keep listening. Because sometimes the most shocking thing about war isn't the cruelty. It's the kindness that somehow refuses to die. The war was over, but Germany still bled. Cities lay like skeletons under a gray sky. Streets reduced to veins of rubble. Windows gaping like wounds that refused to close. In the hospitals that survived, the sound of victory was not cheering. It was coughing, crying, the rustle of bandages soaked through with blood. The flags had changed, but the suffering had not. And, for the women in white coats, the nurses of the fallen Reich, there was no end, only exhaustion. They moved like ghosts through corridors lined with men who had lost limbs, eyes, hope. Some were Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought to the last bullet. Others were boys in Hitler Youth uniforms, their faces still round with childhood. A few were civilians caught in the bombings, nameless, burned, unrecognizable. Every bed was occupied, every hallway crowded with cots. The air was thick with ether, disinfectant, and rot. Flies gathered on the edges of gauze and the open mouths of the unconscious. For years, these nurses had been taught that service was duty, flicked, that the fatherland was a body, and they were its healers. But now the fatherland was gone. The swastikas had been torn from the walls, replaced by silence. The portraits of Hitler had been removed by American officers, leaving pale rectangles of clean paint, like ghosts of authority. The new orders were simple. Treat everyone. No sides, no flags, only wounds. But wounds were never neutral. Anna Keller, 23 years old, moved between beds with hands that no longer trembled. They had trembled once, during the air raids, when the ceiling rattled above the ward, when the world outside howled like a furnace. But now, they were steady from habit, from necessity, from the numbness that came when you saw too much to feel anything. She was a nurse of the Wehrmacht once, stationed near Aachen, patching up soldiers who still believed the war could be won. She had whispered "Heil Hitler" 1,000 times without thought. Now she whispered, "Breathe." There was no ideology left in breathing. Outside, American trucks rumbled past the hospital gates. The soldiers who drove them stared at the ruins like visitors to another planet. Some were young, barely older than the men lying bandaged inside. They had been told they were liberators, but liberation felt like pity here. The nurses avoided their eyes. Some spat when they saw the Americans. Others looked down, afraid of what might happen if the occupiers decided to punish them. There were rumors of assaults, of retribution, of kindness twisted into humiliation. In war's aftermath, kindness itself was suspect. Inside the wards, the hierarchy of life had collapsed. A dying German soldier might lie beside a Russian prisoner, their blood soaking into the same sheets. A nurse might cradle a child whose parents had been executed for treason hours before. It was as if morality itself had burned away with the cities. Anna learned to work without questions. To ask was to remember, and to remember was to break. Yet she remembered anyway. The faces, the screaming amputations, the smell of burned skin after phosphorus attacks. The day her fiancé's letter came back unopened, stamped, "Missing, presumed dead." She had not cried then, not even when they told her the war was lost. But now, in this strange, suspended peace, tears came when she least expected them. While she folded bandages, while she wrung out a towel, while she watched the slow rise and fall of a wounded boy's chest. The patients spoke less now. They stared at the ceiling as though it held the answers no one dared speak aloud. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she would hear one of them whisper through fever, "Where are we?" And she didn't know how to answer. The new doctors, some German, some American, issued orders in clipped tones. They used words like rehabilitation, reconstruction, democracy, but none of those words reached the wounded. The men on the cots didn't care about politics. They cared about morphine, about water, about the next hour. And the nurses, once symbols of loyalty, had become witnesses to collapse. One afternoon, Anna stood at the window of the surgical ward. Outside, children scavenged through rubble for food. In the distance, the church bells rang for the first time in months. The sound made her flinch. It didn't sound like peace. It sounded like something trying too hard to believe in itself. Behind her, a nurse named Greta cursed softly. "More Americans coming," she said. Anna turned. Through the doorway, she could see two orderlies wheeling in stretchers. The uniforms were not gray. They were olive drab. The flag stitched to the sleeves was not the swastika, but the white star. Anna froze. For a heartbeat, the old conditioning surged. The enemy. She felt her throat tighten, her pulse quicken. But the wounded on the stretchers weren't monsters. They were boys. Barely men. Their faces gray with shock. Their hands bandaged. Their eyes glassy with pain. One of them murmured something she couldn't understand. English, slurred and broken. The doctor barked an order. "Treat them. They're patients now," Greta hissed under her breath. "After what they did to Dresden." Anna didn't answer. She knelt beside the nearest stretcher. The soldier's uniform was torn, his chest soaked with blood. He looked up at her with unfocused eyes. Frightened. Young. Dying. She pressed a compress against the wound and whispered the only word she could think of. "Shh." He blinked once. She didn't know if he understood, but his breathing steadied. Later that night, as the ward filled with groans in 2 languages, Anna sat in the corner, her hands still smelling of iodine. The nurse's oath was the only law left, to preserve life, even when life no longer made sense. She wondered if the Americans would understand that. She wondered if they'd see her as human. In the distance, thunder rolled across the city. Not bombs this time, just a storm. But to everyone inside the hospital, it sounded the same. The war had ended, yet somehow, no one inside the broken ward could feel it. The next morning began with rain. It drummed against the cracked windows of the ward, mixing with the sound of boots and low voices speaking English in the corridor. The hospital had become a strange border, part German, part American, a place where uniforms meant nothing but history. The smell of antiseptic fought with the damp scent of mud and sweat brought in from outside. Every new stretcher was a reminder that the war might have stopped, but the dying hadn't caught up yet. Anna woke before dawn, as she always did, her fingers swollen from scrubbing instruments through the night. The American wounded had been placed at the far end of the East Ward, separated only by a thin curtain from the German soldiers. The arrangement was deliberate, she suspected, a test to see if they could coexist without hatred breaking through the silence. Some nurses refused to go near them. Others did their duty, Faces blank, voices clipped. Anna was one of the latter. She couldn't afford defiance. Survival had become its own discipline. When she entered the room, the Americans watched her like one might watch an animal in a cage. Cautious, curious, uncertain. They were young, cleaner, their wounds fresher, their boots still holding the smell of foreign soil. One of them, a corporal with bandaged ribs, spoke halting German. "Good. Morning?" His accent twisted the word into something gentle. Anna nodded, not trusting herself to answer. As she changed the dressing on his side, he winced, but didn't pull away. His skin was pale under the gauze, the veins faint blue lines beneath the surface. She tried not to look at him directly. Not at his eyes, not at the insignia on his sleeve, not at the wedding ring glinting faintly beneath grime. He was the enemy, she reminded herself. The one her brothers had fought. The one her city had burned for. And yet, here he was, breathing the same shallow breaths as any man she'd ever nursed. On the other side of the curtain, a German sergeant began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that shook the bed frame. Another nurse, Greta, hurried over, her face hard as flint. The American turned his head toward the sound. "Kamerad?" he asked quietly, testing the word. Anna froze. The German word for comrade. He didn't know what it meant here. What it had once meant to those who'd fought and bled under the same flag now in ashes. But the attempt startled her. It was as though language itself was groping toward mercy. Greta shot him a glare. "You stay quiet," she snapped in broken English. The corporal said nothing more, only nodded, eyes dropping to the floor. Hours passed. Rain turned to drizzle, drizzle to fog. The ward was a single organism, moaning, breathing, sweating in unison. The boundaries between enemy and ally blurred in the smell of blood and disinfectant. The war had taught them all to categorize suffering, to weigh one life against another. But here, pain was just pain. It had no uniform. That night, the power failed. The lights flickered, then died, leaving the ward in half-darkness. Nurses moved like ghosts with candles cupped in their hands. Shadows danced across walls lined with the wounded. Anna passed from bed to bed, checking pulses, changing bandages. The Americans watched her move. A pale figure in white, face streaked with soot and fatigue. At one bed near the end, she stopped. A young American soldier, barely 18, lay unconscious, his face swollen from shrapnel. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Beside him sat another soldier, older, maybe 25, with a splinted arm. He looked up at her, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "My friend," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. Anna nodded. "Er schläft," she whispered. "He's sleeping." The man frowned, not understanding, then nodded anyway, as though the sound of her voice was enough. She took the boy's wrist, felt the faint, flickering pulse. The body was fighting to stay, but she had seen that rhythm too many times before. It was the heartbeat of departure. Hours passed before the boy died. There was no sound, just the slow, final exhale and the stillness afterward. Anna closed his eyes with 2 fingers and drew the sheet up to his chin. The older soldier sat motionless, staring at his friend's face as if waiting for him to breathe again. Then, quietly, he said, "Danke." The word was awkward, heavy with accent, but unmistakable. "Thank you," Anna froze. No one in a German hospital had ever heard an American thank them before. She wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was nod. Later, when she returned to her cot in the corner, she could still hear his voice. Not the sound, but the meaning. That one word had cut through everything she had built to survive. The obedience, the numbness, the silence. It reminded her of what had been lost long before Germany fell. Not cities, not armies, but humanity. In the darkness, she stared at the ceiling, the candle burning low beside her. She thought of all the men she had watched die. German, Russian, now American. They had all said the same things in the end. Mother, God, water, and sometimes nothing at all. But never thank you. The next morning, she saw the older soldier again. He nodded to her as she passed. She hesitated, then whispered back, "Bitte." The German reply, "You're welcome." It was quiet enough that no one else heard. Something changed then. It was small, imperceptible, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. The hatred that had filled the ward for years began to thin. Not disappear, but weaken. Nurses stopped averting their eyes. Soldiers stopped sneering. Silence softened. And for the first time since the war had ended, Anna realized what peace might sound like. Not parades, not speeches, just a word. It happened again 2 nights later, though not the same way. The wards had gone quiet, except for the rhythmic drip of rainwater leaking through a shell hole in the ceiling. Outside, the ruins of the city glistened under the dim orange of distant fires still smoldering in collapsed buildings. Inside, the smell of wet plaster mixed with blood and disinfectant. The war had left everything damp, heavy, and slow. Even time felt swollen, refusing to move. Anna was tending to the American boy who'd lost his leg below the knee. A clean amputation, if such a thing existed. He was barely 20, his hair matted with dirt, his eyes hollow from morphine and disbelief. When he spoke, his voice drifted between exhaustion and apology. "You're German?" he asked softly. "Yes," she answered without looking up. She was tightening the bandage around his stump, her hands moving automatically, fingers tracing the rhythm of procedure. He hesitated. "You help us. Why?" It was the kind of question no one had the courage to ask out loud until the shooting stopped. Anna didn't answer right away. She focused on the knot, pulling it firm but gentle, the way she'd been taught years before, long before the Reich, before the slogans. Then she said quietly, "Because you bleed the same color as we do." He didn't respond for a long time. The candle on the bedside table flickered, casting their shadows onto the wall. The silhouette of a boy who had been taught to fight, and a woman who had been taught to serve. War had made them enemies. Mercy was making them human again. When she finished dressing the wound, she reached for his canteen. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for just an instant. He seemed startled by the contact, by the realization that her hands were warm, not monstrous. "Danke," he said, clumsy and halting, the word thick with accent. The sound stopped her heart. The last time she'd heard that word from a man in uniform, it had been from one of her own, whispered weakly through burned lips before he died in her arms near Aachen. To hear it now, from an American, from him, it broke something inside her. She nodded, unable to speak, then turned away before he could see the tears welling in her eyes. Around her, the ward slept. German soldiers, American soldiers, civilians, all arranged in fragile rows of truce. The walls no longer cared what flag each man had served. The nurses moved like shades in the half-light, their white aprons stained with reminders of how little divided one wound from another. For days after, that word lingered in her mind. Danke. It replayed over and over as she washed blood from sheets, as she stitched wounds that would never heal right. It haunted her because it wasn't supposed to exist here. Gratitude had no place in war. Gratitude made you remember that the person you'd been told to hate could feel pain, could smile, could die. Then, one evening, a group of American medics arrived. They came to collect their wounded, now stable enough to be moved. The nurses stood in the corridor as stretchers passed, olive uniforms on rusted wheels. The atmosphere was uneasy. No one knew what to say. The Germans feared punishment. The Americans feared sympathy. But at the end of the procession, the young amputee from Anna's ward caught her eye. He lifted a trembling hand and gave a small salute. Not the rigid one of a soldier, but a human gesture, a thank you without words. She didn't move. She just watched as he disappeared through the door and into the fog outside. When the sound of the engines faded, she realized the ward had fallen completely silent. Not the fearful silence of defeat, but something different. A quietness that felt almost holy. Later, when she cleaned his empty bed, she found a scrap of paper under the pillow. A torn corner from an American ration label with 2 words written in pencil. Thank you. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, holding that piece of paper in her hands. It was fragile, already smudged by dirt and sweat, yet somehow it felt heavier than any metal she had ever seen pinned to a uniform. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face. Not as an enemy, not as a victim, but as something else entirely. A mirror, perhaps, showing her what the war had stolen from both sides. Compassion had been treated like treason for so long that now even kindness felt dangerous. And yet, something inside her began to thaw. For years, she had survived by obedience, to orders, to discipline, to silence. But that word, that simple act of gratitude, cracked the shell of numbness she had built. It was as if the human world she thought had died in 1939 had whispered back from the grave. In the days that followed, she began to notice small changes in the others. Nurses speaking softly with American medics, trading cigarettes, exchanging a few broken words of English. A German orderly sneaking extra bread to a captured soldier. Little acts that meant nothing and everything at once. The war had taken 6 years to destroy Europe. Humanity was rebuilding itself one whisper, one gesture at a time. And yet, even in that fragile peace, guilt remained. Each act of mercy carried the shadow of betrayal. When Anna lay awake at night, she heard the voices of the dead. The men who had called her sister as they bled out. The ones who would never have forgiven her for touching the hand of the enemy. But she could not unhear that, thank you. It had changed her more than the war itself, because in that one word, she had seen the beginning of something the bombs could never kill. The snow came early that year. It fell softly over the ruins, covering the broken stones and burnt timbers like a blanket that refused to admit what lay beneath. The war was over, but winter had a way of reminding people that peace could still feel cold. The hospital's roof leaked in 6 places, and every breath came out as mist. But for the first time, the nurses no longer looked over their shoulders when they worked. The Americans had stopped watching them as jailers. They watched them as people. Anna moved through the ward wrapped in a wool blanket, her fingers raw from cold water. The work never changed. Bandages, sutures, morphine. But the atmosphere had shifted. The hatred that once poisoned every exchange now seemed embarrassed of itself, shrinking in the quiet. Soldiers who had once spat curses at their captors now traded words of halting humor. The American medics shared their cigarettes with German orderlies. Someone even smuggled in a record player from the black market. A small miracle in a city without electricity. At night, when the generator rumbled, jazz hummed faintly through the halls, threading through the groans of the dying like a strange kind of absolution. For the first time, Anna saw the ward as something living again, not just a graveyard with beds. She watched as an American corporal taught a German boy how to roll a cigarette with one hand. She heard laughter, hesitant but real. She even caught herself smiling once, then quickly stopped, ashamed of the feeling. The memory of what she'd believed in, what she'd served, was still there, heavy as a stain she couldn't wash out. One evening, the head doctor gathered the staff. He was an old man with a voice like worn paper. "There is to be cooperation," he said simply. "Between us and them. Orders from the commandant." The nurses exchanged looks. Cooperation meant more proximity, more exposure, more discomfort. But no one protested. They had learned that obedience was easier than opinion, so they worked together. Americans and Germans side by side. Anna found herself partnered with a medic named Thomas. Quiet, dark-haired, carrying the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from war alone, but from the weight of seeing too much of it. His German was broken, her English worse, but somehow they managed. The language of medicine was older than both of them. He showed her how to disinfect with iodine instead of alcohol. She showed him how to bind wounds with salvaged linen when supplies ran out. They spoke in gestures, in nods, in small half-smiles. It wasn't friendship, it was recognition. One afternoon, as they worked on a frost-bitten German soldier, Thomas asked haltingly, "Why you stay?" Or, "Over." His tone wasn't accusation, just curiosity. Anna hesitated, tightening a tourniquet. "Where would I go?" she said softly. "There's nothing left." She thought of her parents, both gone in the bombings, of her home reduced to rubble. The hospital was all she had left that still resembled purpose. He nodded, understanding more from her silence than her words. "Same," he said after a moment. "Different war. Same ghosts." It was the first time she realized that the Americans, too, were haunted. That the victors bled invisibly. Thomas carried himself with the quiet of a man who had seen his share of death and had run out of reasons to hate the people who caused it. The days bled into one another. Snow melted, froze again. The ward filled with a kind of fragile peace. There were moments when Anna almost forgot the world outside, the ruins, the hunger, the fear of retribution. Inside, humanity was beginning to rebuild itself from the smallest gestures. A shared cigarette, a translated joke, a handshake that neither side expected to offer. But outside the hospital walls, bitterness still ruled. Former soldiers roamed the streets, hollow-eyed and bitter. Civilians spat at Americans, calling them occupiers. The rubble was full of old loyalties that refused to die. When one of the nurses was caught laughing with a U.S. soldier, the locals hissed at her on her way home. "Traitor," they called her. Anna heard it too, though no one said it to her face. She could feel the accusation in every glance when she walked through the market, in the way people looked at her clean uniform, her steady stride. They didn't understand. Maybe they never would. That helping the enemy wasn't betrayal anymore. It was all that was left of decency. One night, Thomas found her outside the ward, sitting on the steps, smoking in the freezing wind. "You okay?" he asked, his breath fogging. She handed him the cigarette. "People think I forgot what side I'm on." He took a slow drag, exhaled. "Maybe. There's no side anymore." She looked at him then, really looked at him. The tired eyes, the unshaven face, the humanity beneath the uniform. For the first time since 1939, she believed he might be right. They sat in silence, watching the snow drift through the light of a broken street lamp. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't anything that simple. It was two people, stripped of everything the war had told them to be, realizing there was nothing left to hate. Inside, someone turned up the volume on the record player. The notes of an American jazz tune spilled softly through the window, faint, trembling, yet defiantly alive. Anna closed her eyes and listened. For a brief moment, the music drowned out the ghosts. When she opened them again, Thomas was watching her. "Peace," he said quietly, gesturing toward the sound. She nodded. "Peace," she repeated, the word unfamiliar in her mouth, fragile as glass. And somewhere deep inside her, deeper than fear, deeper than guilt, she felt something she hadn't in years. Not joy, not forgiveness, just the first faint echo of warmth returning to a heart that had forgotten how to beat. Years later, when the city had rebuilt itself into neat gray order and the ruins were buried under new walls, Anna would sometimes wake in the night and smell ether. The memory came like a pulse, antiseptic and smoke, metal and rain. She would open her eyes and realize she was home, in her small flat near the river, the ward decades gone. But the air would still carry the ghost of that ward, the sound of boots in corridors, the murmur of dying men, the weight of words that once changed everything. Time hadn't healed anything. It had only given her distance, enough to look back and finally see what those years had made of her. Germany had become a place of silence. The past was something people spoke about only in whispers, and only when they were certain no one else could hear. The world called it peace, reconstruction, progress. But peace is never quiet for those who remember. It hums beneath the surface, like a machine that can't quite shut down. She still worked as a nurse, though the new hospitals were cleaner, brighter, mercifully free of uniforms. She kept her hair short, her hands steady, her voice calm. Patients loved her because she never raised it, never hurried, never judged. But when she looked in the mirror, she sometimes saw the girl from Aachen, the one who had believed that duty meant obedience, that loyalty could make cruelty righteous. That girl was gone, but she watched from behind Anna's eyes like a ghost asking for forgiveness. Some days, old American tourists came to the hospital on goodwill visits. Veterans? Their shoulders stooped now, their medals dull with age. They would shake hands with the German doctors and smile for photographs, part of some ceremony of reconciliation. Hannah avoided them when she could. She didn't know what she would say if one of them looked at her and recognized the face that had leaned over them in a dim ward half a lifetime ago. Once, though it happened, he came with a delegation in 1961, a group of veterans visiting hospitals that had once treated Allied wounded. He was older now, hair silvered, but the eyes were the same, the quiet ones. She recognized him before she could stop herself. Thomas, the American medic, who had shared cigarettes with her in the snow. He didn't see her at first. The officials led him past the polished floors and antiseptic halls. Then his gaze caught hers, and for a moment the years vanished. There was no ceremony left between them, just recognition. He smiled faintly, the same tired human smile that had carried her through that winter. "Anna," he said softly, as if testing whether the name still existed. "Thomas." Her voice trembled on it. She hadn't spoken his name in decades. They sat together later in the cafeteria, two ghosts borrowing the bodies of survivors. The room smelled of coffee and disinfectant, cleaner now, civilized. But the silence between them was the same. "I didn't think you were still alive," he said. "Most days, I'm not sure I am," she replied. It was meant as a joke, but it fell like truth. He nodded, eyes down. "Do you remember the boy? The one who died? The one you—" "Yes." Her answer was immediate. "I remember all of them." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know, we were told not to trust you. Not to even let you near us. They said German nurses poisoned prisoners. But you—" He stopped. The words didn't need finishing. Anna looked at her hands, the same hands that had tied bandages, closed eyes, carried bodies. "We were told worse about you," she said. "And yet—" "You said thank you." His eyes softened. "I meant it," she smiled, but it wasn't joy. It was something smaller, sadder. "I know. That's what frightened me most." They laughed then. Quiet, broken laughter that felt like breathing after years underwater. Around them, nurses passed carrying trays. Doctors barked orders. Life moved on, unknowing, uncaring. But for that moment, time had folded in on itself. And the war was close again, not in noise or fire, but in the fragile understanding that had once made them both human when the world had forgotten how. Before he left, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue. A torn scrap of yellowed paper, edges soft with age. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. "I kept it," he said. "I thought I'd lost it, but somehow it always turned up again. In my kit, in my books. Like it didn't want to go away." She unfolded it gently. The pencil marks were faint, but still visible. "Thank you." She felt her throat tighten. "You shouldn't have kept this." she whispered. It was just a word. He shook his head. No, it wasn't. They said goodbye at the station later that evening. The train hissed like steam escaping from another time. He touched the brim of his hat in an old-fashioned gesture of respect, and she raised her hand in return. Neither promised to write. They didn't need to. What connected them couldn't be captured in words anymore. That night, as the city lights flickered across the river, Anna sat by her window and watched her reflection in the glass. She thought of the thousands of people who had lived and died inside hospitals, both sides of the war, both sides of humanity. She thought of how easy it had been to believe the lies, that enemies were less than human, that mercy was weakness, that obedience was virtue. She wondered how many others had learned too late that kindness is the only thing that survives destruction. Years blurred into decades. The Cold War came, then the wall, then the next generation, born without the scars of the last. The tanks and uniforms were replaced by different flags, different fears. But the lesson remained the same. Hatred was efficient. Compassion was slow, fragile, costly, but it lasted. When Anna finally retired, she donated her nurse's uniform to a small museum. The curator asked if she had any stories to share about the end of the war. She almost said no, but then she told them about the hospital, about the boy who died, about the American who said thank you. They wrote it down, just a few lines in a ledger that no one would probably read. But as she left, she felt lighter, as if something long held in silence had finally been heard. On her last night alive, many years later, in a quiet hospice room filled with flowers and soft lamplight, she whispered to the nurse beside her, "If they ever ask what war teaches us, tell them this. The enemy is just someone who's hurting the same way you are." And then she smiled, her eyes unfocused, as if she could still see the ward. The flickering candles, the snow outside, the boy's faint breath, the piece of paper under his pillow. In the silence before the end, she heard it again. The word that had never left her. Thank you.